In this program, we will deal with the theories science has advanced to explain the emergence and evolution of the species. The scientists' findings are fascinating, but they have not been able to dispel the great myths. You may have already seen ammonite or starfish fossils. The ancients believed they were created by a whim of nature. It took a long time before it dawned on us that they were in fact traces of former lives. Paleontology is the science that studies fossils. All the forms of life that have existed on Earth may have left fossils. Plants, mollusks, insects, and of course, dinosaurs and humans. Paleontologists are also interested in microfossils. By studying fish scales or pollen, they were able to glean all kinds of information. Fossils constitute our best source of information on the evolution of life since it first emerged on Earth some 4 billion years ago. The theory of evolution has been much more readily accepted since paleontologists began applying themselves to the study of fossils, the remains of animals found in rocks. When Darwin first published this theory, it caused quite a stir because it demolished the belief that God had created all living organisms in a matter of days. Indeed, fossils are proof positive of evolution and show us the history of life, a history that has been evolving for the past 4 billion years. When an organism fossilizes, it leaves traces of its existence with an imprint or even some structures of its body. However, an organism will only fossilize under certain conditions. First, at death, the organism must be buried quickly, be immediately isolated from its predators, or such climatic agents as heat, light, and water. Such agents might attack the organism and decompose it. If the organism falls to the bottom of the water, for instance, fine particles suspended in the water, called sediments, help to bury it. The sediments trapping it accumulate over the course of time in successive layers. They eventually consolidate into sedimentary rocks. Movements of the Earth's crust sometimes bring these very ancient rocks back up to the surface, enabling us to examine them for fossils. The process of fossilization also requires a burying terrain that will protect the organism from decomposition. This ideal milieu is said to be anaerobic, or devoid of oxygen. It therefore excludes the presence of most bacteria and fungi which need oxygen to survive, and to go about their business of decaying and decomposing dead organisms. Their absence contributes to the preservation of the bodies. Generally, the presence of pyrite, a mineral made up of sulfur and iron, inside the sediments indicates that the fossilization milieu was deprived of oxygen. The fossils may then be covered in pyrite. Occasionally, the biological structures themselves have been replaced by pyrite. Fossilization can also occur when an animal is buried under a mound of volcanic ash. Insects can be preserved in amber, a resin produced by a conifer. As for the glaciers, they preserved prehistoric animals by freezing them. Even men have been fossilized by volcanic ashes, as during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii in Italy. The body parts that best resist decomposition are the mineralized structures, such as the bones, teeth, shells, scales. Conversely, the soft parts, like the intestines, eyes, and heart, usually disappear. When they do not disappear completely, they turn into a concentrate of pure carbon, The organic matter that makes up the soft parts gradually loses its volatile elements, such as oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, retaining only the carbon. The carbon is in the form of charcoal. It is worth noting that the immense tropical forests that once covered the Earth have fossilized as well. Today they represent important sources of that valuable fuel, coal. The fossils the paleontologists collect in the stratified sediments attest to the constant changes organisms have undergone over the ages. Paleontologists will very often come across species now vanished from the surface of the Earth. Some of these animals, such as the dinosaurs, have become totally extinct. Others, however, have evolved, producing descendants down to our day. Paleontologists have managed to extract the remains of a fish with certain characteristic features of the first land animals, amphibians. This fish's fins contain the same bones as the paws of land animals. The fossil also has inner nostrils, which would suggest that the animal had lungs and could breathe air. Moreover, the way the bones of its head are positioned and the structure of its teeth strangely resemble an amphibian's. This part fish, part amphibian animal is therefore an intermediary link in the chain between life in the water and life on land. Most paleontologists agree that it is probably our oldest ancestor. So it's thanks to paleontological research that we are able to better understand how the various species came to evolve and differ from each other. Life has been evolving on our planet for 4 billion years. Just think of it. 4 billion years. It's a scale of time we're not too familiar with. It's simpler if we compare those 4 billion years to a single year. Say the first bacteria emerged around the month of April, and man on December 31st at 11:55 p.m. On a scale like that, we've existed all of 5 minutes. Life has a very long evolutionary history. While characterized by long periods of stability, the history of life has been punctuated by determining episodes. These episodes have mainly served to increase the degree of complexity of living organisms. The very first forms of life began, it would seem, in the oceans, from complex organic molecules that assembled into minuscule clusters of droplets called coacervates. The oldest traces of living organisms were found in sedimentary rocks in Greenland and date back some 3,800,000,000 years. These fossils are in the form of unicellular creatures, such as bacteria and blue-green algae. These primitive life forms were the only living things to inhabit the planet during almost 2 billion years. The one evolutionary event most instrumental in speeding up the course of the history of life was the development of a nucleus in a cell. Up until that time, the unicellular organisms that existed had no nuclei and survived by splitting into two identical cells. The advent of the nucleus completely changed how cells replicated. The nucleus, receptacle of genetic material, led to the emergence of the sexes. From then on, through sexual reproduction, the forming of a new being involved the meeting of the genetic background of two different individuals. This method of reproduction introduced a greater possibility of diversity between individuals. That diversity helped to ensure the survival and evolution of the species. Meanwhile, in the oceans, multicellular beings began to emerge. Gradually, their structure became more complex, leading to the emergence of the first soft-bodied animals. The next major improvement to mark the course of evolution was probably the formation of the skeleton. First, in an external position in the form of a shell or a carapace, the skeleton in invertebrates like mollusks or crustaceans is a protective shield against predators. Another later important event in evolution was the emergence of the first aquatic vertebrates, which somewhat resembled fish without jaws. Because muscles were inserted into their inner skeletons, species became bigger, stronger, and more mobile. Animals equipped with this structure were easily able to conquer new habitats. Little by little, the fish came to rule the oceans. Some acquired the capacity to breathe and get about out of the water. The species then began to change into amphibians. However, because of their method of reproduction, amphibians are still not quite free of their water habitat. Amphibians lay gelatinous eggs that require water to hatch. Another turning point in evolution was the formation of a rigid shell containing amniotic fluid that makes it possible for the first stages of an embryo's development to take place, safe from the dryness on land. Reptiles were the happy beneficiaries of this evolutionary outcome. During 170 million years, they would rule the Earth. They diversified into various extraordinary shapes and sizes, such as the dinosaurs who vanished mysteriously, to be replaced by two separate descendants, birds and mammals. For the last 65 million years, mammals have literally boomed. Because of their amazing ability to adapt, they were able to colonize every possible ecological niche in the air, the oceans, and on land. Finally, among the primate mammals, a semi-biped animal form emerged. It heralded the advent of primitive man that took place about 2 million years ago. This sequence of evolutionary events highlights the countless family ties between the various animal groups. It even enables us to draw up a family tree that branches out to include all varieties of living things. This genealogical tree, illustrating the different evolutionary lineages, helped to establish taxonomy, the classification of the different living organisms. Taxonomy's base category is the species. The species is made up of populations of individuals who in nature reproduce among themselves and are sexually isolated from other species. However, the frontier separating two species of mice, for example, said to be twin species, is sometimes virtually imperceptible. You then have to seek their distinct features in their genes, based on sophisticated techniques of biochemical genetics. Today, the study of the evolution of the species focuses on data concealed in cells. Genetics has become the prime tool paleontologists use in their attempts to solve these mysteries. For the famed English naturalist Charles Darwin, evolution was a slow and gradual process. The emergence of new species was explained as the result of an accumulation of tiny, individual variations. But scientists today are seriously questioning his theories. A species can change within certain limits, but an equus remains an equus. It doesn't turn into a primate. In their view, Darwin's theory may explain microevolution, that is, evolution within a species, but not explain macroevolution, that is, the emergence of new species. The controversy proves that in the realm of evolution, theories too constantly change. For a long time now, scientists agree on the notion of a continuous process of life forms through the ages. However, no consensus has yet been reached concerning the mechanisms by which this process occurs. How does a species change into a more evolved one? Scientists have attempted to solve the puzzle by formulating various evolutionary theories. The emergence of new life forms was first ascribed to divine intervention. Lamarckism was the first evolutionary theory to shake the beliefs of the creationists. According to Lamarck, a French naturalist, the giraffe, for instance, has a long neck because at a certain moment in its evolution, the food available in its ecological niche happened to be located on treetops. The animals thus had to constantly stretch their necks to reach their food source. Lamarck also imagined that this feature, acquired during the animal's lifetime, would through heredity be passed on to future generations. However, it was only with the fundamental discoveries of genetics that scientists realized that the characteristics of an individual, such as the length of its neck, are determined by the genes at conception and not at birth. It was by observing pigeons that Darwin came across a key to solving the mystery of how one species mutates into another one. The breeders of the pigeons managed to create new races of pigeons by crossing the pigeons they felt showed the best traits. Darwin then theorized that nature probably proceeded according to the same principle, by selecting the best among the individuals. In nature, the individuals of a same species have the same characteristics, more or less. According to Darwin, these slight variations between individuals are indicated by a greater or lesser capacity to survive. He theorized that the individuals who were the least well adapted to the conditions of their environment would be disadvantaged and the least likely to survive. Conversely, the specimens best armed to face their predators, competition, the rigors of climate, were most likely to survive and reproduce, leaving behind them a great many offspring which will have inherited these advantageous predispositions. Perfectly adapted to their environment, the descendants would be so different from their ancestors that they would in fact constitute a new species. Through this process he called natural selection, Darwin managed to explain the birth of a new species. However, Darwin had not managed to clearly elucidate the origin of the variations between the members of a same species. Today, scientists assume that genetic mutations are responsible for such variations. Mutations are unexpected changes that occur within the genetic material of an individual. Such accidental mutations usually have a debilitating effect. For example, in man, numerous blood diseases are caused by mutations affecting the genes that control the synthesis of the blood cells. Individuals with such mutations are afflicted with grave handicaps that limit their chances of producing many offspring. On the other hand, some mutations have a positive effect. They enable their carrier to live better, longer, and to continue the strain through numerous offspring. This group of offspring will concentrate its own genetic features, so much so that ultimately it will no longer be able to reproduce with other individuals of the original population. A woman today, for instance, would be unable to reproduce with a representative of Homo erectus, the species that preceded Homo sapiens sapiens by about 1 million years. In nature, genetic mutations happen spontaneously. They can also be the result of exposure to chemical mutagenic agents, or radiation, for instance. Genes can also be changed in the laboratory intentionally. Through genetic engineering, scientists can create new, improved species, such as cows that will produce more milk while consuming less fodder. Sometimes their experiments lead to the creation of totally ludicrous species, such as giant mice. These kinds of experiments may eventually be conducted on human genetic material. Such feats attest to the fact that man is constantly gaining power over nature. The tools available to him may eventually enable him to control the course of evolution. But ethically, does he have the right to do so? Given modern man's adaptability, a new species of Homo is unlikely to emerge, unless a species is created from deliberately induced genetic variations, a sort of Homo geneticus.